Desperation and the Regulators. One of these books was great, and the other one was easily the worst book that I've read this year. Can you guess which one's which? It's time for a double book review. Okay, so let's start with something quite interesting to me anyway, which is the story behind the story of these two twin books that were released on the same day. So back in 1991, Stephen King is driving through this kind of eerie, spooky ghost town in Nevada called Ruth. And as he's driving through, he's thinking to himself, where is everyone? You know, why is there no one in this whole town? And then he hears this voice in his head and it says, everyone's dead. The sheriff did it. Anyway, fast forward to 1994 and Stephen King is riding around America on his Harley. Cool, right? That's cool. And he's doing a bookstore tour promoting his book Insomnia. The moment the tour's over, on November 1st, he sits down to start to write Desperation. It's when he's starting to write Desperation that all of a sudden he's struck with inspiration for another book. And this book is about guns and toys and life in the American suburbs. And he thinks to himself, why not? For each book, he uses the same character names and actually decides to release them both, one under Stephen King, one under his pseudonym Richard Bachman, and he releases them both in 1996, and they debut at number 1 and 2 on the New York Times bestseller list, and they stay there for 15 weeks. In these two books, Stephen King delves deeper into the idea of twinners. And he wanted to explore the idea of what would happen if you took the same set of characters and threw them into parallel universes under very different circumstances. He was so committed to the idea of parallel universes that he actually penned, as I mentioned, the Regulators under his pseudonym of Richard Bachman. And this just gives, as we're going to talk about, the two books distinctly different voices. This is actually the first Richard Bachman book that I've read, and you know, I like the idea of it. I like the playfulness of Stephen King in this scenario. I'm guessing that Richard Bachman is supposed to represent Stephen King's twinner. I like the idea that somewhere out there's a Richard Bachman who is bringing out all of Stephen King's books, but just with a different slant. It's fun. So in this video, as part of my journey to the Dark Tower, I'm going to be talking about each one of these books, and I'm going to talk about what I liked and what I didn't like about each of them. We're starting off with Desperation. The opening of this book is really, really good. Mary and Peter Jackson are driving down a highway in Nevada. It's pretty desolate, and they get pulled over by a police officer. And this guy is just an absolute mountain, or where I come from, they'd call him a unit. And he is so big that the whole time I was picturing him as Dave Bautista. That's how big he is. Anyway, after a bag of something is found in the trunk of their car, they're taken off in the cop car. And this scene is the first scene where I really got a good shiver. You know, and I love that Stephen King shiver. As he's driving them in his cop car and they start to see a town in the distance, he begins to read them their Miranda rights. And he's saying, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you do say may be given in evidence against you. I'm going to kill you. You have the right to an attorney. And the reason that I call that a Stephen King shiver is because it's something that he does quite regularly, where he takes this kind of seemingly normal, everyday scenario and then just completely flips it on its head in an instant. And you just, oh, what did he say? What did he say? And that's what Peter and Mary are thinking in this scenario. They're kind of looking at each other. Did you hear him say that? Oh, man. And from this point, like, things go from bad to worse, because when they actually reach the town of Desperation, Mary and Peter are looking out of the windows of the cop car and they see bodies hanging from the lampposts. People are laid out in the street. It's just an absolute massacre has taken place in this town. And you start to get the idea that Collie and Trajan, and I think that's how we're pronouncing his name, Collie and Trajan, who's the cop, um, he it's not just him that's been infected by this wrongness. It's actually the town that's been infected. And he is just a symptom of that infection. They reach the police station, more bodies. And then Peter, taken out, and Mary's by herself. He's walking her up to the jail cells. And then when she... Actually, do you know what? This actually might be one of Stephen King's best openings ever. Now that I'm kind of reliving it, I think this might be one of his best openings ever. She comes into the jail cell and she looks around. There's a bunch of other prisoners and they're all kind of screaming through the bars. Grab his gun, grab his gun. Don't let him lock you up. He's going to keep you here. There's something wrong with him. There's something wrong with him. Grab his gun, grab his gun. And she kind of looks around, makes a split-second decision, goes for it, kind of has a struggle, fails, and then she's locked up. And Collie in Trajan he seems to be enjoying this chaos. You know, that's something that's really spooky about the character. I really liked him actually, is that he seems to have pretty good humor about all of this chaos. He's like, oh, you almost got me, you know? He's crazy, and I like that. One of the other characters that I was really happy to see was Cynthia from Rose Madder. She was actually one of my favorite characters from Rose Madder. So it was great to see her return. And, you know, she's her plucky, weird self. And it's just nice to see that she goes on being weird, being kind of a bit quirky, even after everything that she went through in Rose Madder. She hasn't been broken by those events. So that was really nice. I think one of the really cool things about Desperation is how Stephen King is able to kind of keep you on your toes with the different brands of horror that he can produce. So on one hand, you've got just this mental copper running around town, performing this big massacre, and he's just doing unspeakable things to these innocent people. And then in between, he's kind of laughing maniacally, you know? And you think to yourself, I know this. I've seen this narrative before. And then out of left field, he'll just hit you with this kind of Lovecraftian cosmic horror as Collie starts to speak in a language from another world. You know, he'll just kind of break out in it in between his laughter. Tuck, 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 a lot. And all of a sudden, this story isn't about some small town copper who's lost his mind. It's actually about a battle between good and evil and ancient gods that have been unsurfaced in a mine. I found Tuck to be a really good villain in Desperation. He's a little bit different to a lot of other Stephen King villains in that he doesn't actually have a physical form. He is this almost floating entity where the only way he can inflict any real damage is through possessing the bodies of these people and sometimes animals as well. The only problem is that human bodies aren't really meant to hold these entities, and so they start to break down, and that leads to, you know, gross body horror, and then he has to move on to another host. And so there's always that danger that, you know, he could be any one of us. A little bit reminiscent of The Thing. I also like the idea that he's always been here. He's just been under the surface, and then he's just been unleashed as they unsurfaced him under a mine that they've been digging into, and now he's just been, you know, like I say, unleashed onto this small town in the middle of nowhere. That's just very spooky. Another thing that you'll realize quite quickly is that in this book, nobody is safe. Young children are hung like meat on hooks. People's faces are eaten by cougars. Other people who you quite like get scalped by vultures. People are possessed by demons and break out of their skin. This is full-on Stephen King stuff. Religion actually plays a really big part in Desperation also. And what's interesting about that is that this book was published at a time when Stephen King was coming out of Alcoholics Anonymous. So much for the Anonymous. But Alcoholics Anonymous, a big part of that is religion, the religious aspect. Think about the Serenity Prayer, for example. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the strength to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So while Stephen King is writing this book, he's also kind of rediscovering or reaffirming his faith. And actually, in an interview in 2014, Stephen King said, "I made a decision to believe in God because it's better to believe than not to believe. So it was easy to say, if I've got a power greater than myself, okay, that's fine. I can use that to make life livable and good." I actually didn't realize that Stephen King was a believer in God. And in a way, it's kind of surprising just because of how he represents Christian characters in so many of his books. So I don't know if that was if he converted at some point, or if he was just raised Christian and was always Christian and just kind of had a bit of self-awareness about the different ways that his religion could kind of be corrupted. But I found that to be really interesting. So in Desperation, you've actually got two sides of the coin. You've got David Carter, who, thanks to an event that happened a couple of years ago when he was a little bit younger even, he kind of discovered the power of prayer. And even though both of his parents are non-believers, he became a devout Christian. And then you've got David Carter, not David Carter, I just said that, John Marinville. And so John Marinville is this kind of skeptical atheist character who, yeah, he finds it very difficult to believe in anything that he can't see. But in the end, both of these characters kind of come to the agreed realization that God is powerful, but God is cruel. You know, there are some cheesy moments in Desperation where David is recreating some of the miracles of Jesus. But overall, there are some quite deep themes that are explored in the book, and I enjoyed it overall. So will someone explain to me then why this is trash? Why is this rubbish? I understand that it's the same villain in each book, right? But I just hated the cowboy, the cartoon cowboy, motor cop thing. I didn't like it. I don't even think it's a bad concept for a book. It's not the concept that I have a problem with. It's quite interesting, you know, if you think about a young boy is possessed by an ancient demon, and then his imagination is projected onto a small town in suburban America, and they are under attack by the figments of the boy's imagination. These cartoon cowboys, these wacky creatures are just transforming this whole town into, like I say, a cartoonish hellscape. That's actually pretty interesting on paper, but it just doesn't carry the same weight and the same kind of, I don't want to say gravitas, but the same weight as Desperation carries. Just like Desperation, I feel like the first few pages of this book, you know, first 20, 30 pages of the book were strong. I thought it started strong. Stephen King, just as he often does, paints this excellent, beautiful picture of, an American suburb. These people are mowing their lawns, they're cooking barbecues, they're eating apple pie and ice cream, you know, American stuff. And then an unmarked van comes slowly driving down the street and starts mowing everyone down. It's shocking. And not only is it shocking, it's intriguing, it's mysterious, you know? What is this van? Who are these people? Why are they doing this? But as soon as I found out that these bad guys were cartoon characters, I don't know. It felt like a cheesy B movie. You know what? It felt like Goosebumps. And I liked Goosebumps. Listen, I grew up reading Goosebumps. I like Goosebumps. No problem. This felt like bad goosebumps. And I don't know, because like I said, this is the first Richard Bachman book that I've ever read. So I don't know if through using the pseudonym of Richard Bachman, he approaches with Stephen King approaches his books and his writing process with something totally different. It didn't feel like a Stephen King book. Like I said, maybe he's approaching it at a different angle. Maybe giving himself license to be more childlike, more playful. I don't know, but I personally didn't enjoy it. And also, I felt like there was some potential as well in having these kind of twinner books where the characters exist in different universes. I like that idea. I really like that idea. But you can't just give the characters the same names and have those character names be completely different people. It's not like they were similar or different versions of themselves. Yeah, maybe John Marinville, maybe Cynthia, but David Carter was a completely different character. So, yeah, beyond that, it was just kind of a gimmick. It felt like a marketing ploy. And that took me out of the story. It would have been really interesting to see maybe David Carter represented in this story, but he never found his faith. And so we get to see that character live out his life, you know? That would have been a lot more interesting. But like I say, I feel like it was just, in the end, a gimmick to give these characters who had no relation to one another the same names. Like a lot of Stephen King books that I've read, it's very gory, it's very vivid in its description of the gore, and so it's kind of unhinged and shocking, but somehow simultaneously it manages to be boring. And I think that's because none of the characters really play any kind of meaningful role. The only character who does is Seth, who is the young autistic boy that's kind of projecting his imagination on the town. He's the only one who has any kind of autonomy, it seems like, ironically, right? Because he's being possessed, but he's making decisions that affect the story. The rest of the characters are just kind of like looking at this van coming down the street. Oh, run, hide. They all hide. Some people get mowed down. They re-emerge. Oh no, the van's coming again. Run, hide. Comes down, some people get mowed down. They come out, they hide again. I was just thinking, why is this is just so repetitive, you know? So how can it be this crazy and this boring at the same time? And, you know, I don't like to be too much of a downer. I like to give my opinions, but I don't want to be too much of a downer. And so I'm not going to talk about the Regulators too much because I just don't have anything really to say about it. Definitely nothing good to say about it, other than the concept. It was kind of interesting. I didn't enjoy it. And so, and also, I don't know what connection these books have to the Dark Tower. Right, so I'm reading these books as part of the extended universe of the Dark Tower, and I don't know how these books are kind of connected in any way. So it felt like a massive detour away from following the path of the beam. I enjoyed reading Desperation, so that's good, but I really could have done without the Regulators. So normally at this stage, what I do is give a rating of each of the aspects of the book. But because I'm talking about both books now, and I don't want it to drag on too much, I'm just going to give an overall rating of both of the books. I'm going to give Desperation a 3.5 stars out of 5. I enjoyed it. It was fun. Not my favorite Stephen King book, but you know, it was a good time. And I'm going to give The Regulators a 0.5 stars out of 5. Unfortunately, it was the worst book that I've read this whole year. Not the worst Stephen King book, the worst book that I've read this year, out of about 50. So yeah, I really didn't enjoy it. Now, as I mentioned, I'm actually reading my way through the extended multiverse toward the Dark Tower for the very first time. It's a 23-book journey to the tower, and these two books were book 13 and 14 on my journey. And so next week, I'm going to be reading and reviewing 2 more books on my journey to the Dark Tower, and they are Everything's Eventual which is a collection of short stories by Stephen King. It's 14 dark tales. And also The Little Sisters of Eluria, which is a graphic novel. So that'll be a lot of fun to review as well. Even though this wasn't such a positive review for the Regulators, I hope that you enjoyed the video anyway. And if you'd like to continue our journey together, where you can find out what I thought of The Little Sisters of Eluria and Everything's Eventual, then you can click up here to see the review. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Happy reading.